Hey everyone, for today's video we are going to be examining different types of economic policy. This is just a broad-based introduction to a few different schools of thought and how they're applied. So to start out with, we're looking at the classical viewpoint, which is also the Austrian viewpoint that you'll see referenced, and sometimes you'll just see it referred to as Hayek, the way Hayek approached it. And frequently, this is the approach more aligned with supply side policy. Now, uh, the classical approach is really what the AP test is going to ask you to know in terms of terminology. It is less, it's not going to ask you to know the Austrian or Hayek, or it will ask some supply side stuff, but classical is going to be the main part of this. So, the basic idea behind the classical viewpoint is that when you're experiencing a demand shock in either direction, so you see demand decreases here, you have a negative demand shock. What occurs is as you have rising inflation, or as you have rising unemployment, more and more workers are willing to accept lower wages to respond to this shock. So this means that their nominal wages will fall. When nominal wages fall, that's something that shifts short run aggregate supply to the right. That takes us back to our full level of employment, and we have what is termed as a self correcting economy. So that's kind of how you have to think of this, as a self correcting economy. The same thing would happen if demand shifted in the opposite direction. So if demand shifted to the right and we had a positive demand shock, and now we are in an inflationary gap. When we have this, we have higher than normal levels of employment going on. So people will start arguing for higher wages to make up for inflation, and because they're better able to, they have a better labor market. So they argue for and receive higher wages. When they do that, the higher nominal wages is something that shifts short run aggregate supply to the left, once again bringing us back to our full level of employment. Once again, we've got a self correcting economy. That's what the classical side is all about. It's about short run aggregate supply always correcting the economy back in the long run. Now, you might be saying, well, how does this support supply side? What should we do in this case? What the classical economists with the Austrian school or Hayek or supply siders would say is that we need policies to help grow our short run and long run aggregate supplies, have policies to shift those to the right. So we need to encourage more business investment and things of that nature. That is the role of people in the economy at this point in terms of how do you interact with it in a positive way if you're trying to implement some sort of policy. On the other side, we have Keynesianism. And so Keynesianism comes around essentially growing out of the Great Depression. And this was already something he was toying with in his mind. But John Maynard Keynes, pictured here, thinks that self-correction might either not happen or take too long to happen. He's very famous for the quote, in the long run, we're all dead. In other words, we might not get there. I mean, the long run is an ill-defined part of time in the future. So he says we can't wait. The people who are out of work are people. We need to humanize the economy. And so he advocates for something called stabilization policy. And that is actively using government policy to reduce the severity of recessions and rein in excessively strong expansion. So taming inflation on the other end. And for Keynes himself, he mainly wanted to use fiscal policy to do this. Fiscal policy and the specifics of fiscal policy we'll talk about in the next video. But when you are responding to demand shocks, if you're a Keynesian, so here we have a negative demand shock. What you would do is you would institute either fiscal or monetary policy. Once again, we'll go over fiscal policy in the next video. Monetary policy will be the next unit. And what you do is you institute expansionary fiscal policy. So you have aggregate demand shifted to the left. Well, what you need to do, according to Keynesians, is shift it right back where it came from. So you need to increase aggregate demand, not worry so much about allowing short-run aggregate supply to self-correct, but instead correcting the economy in the first place. You can see the same thing on the other end. If aggregate demand is shifted to the right and we have an inflationary gap going on, what you should do is rein in that inflation by causing by in effect causing a negative demand shock. So you are instituting contractionary monetary or fiscal policy to shift aggregate demand back where it was. Now I'll talk once again about what it is that you do when you institute those policies to shift aggregate demand back in later videos. Now, the problem though is what happens when you have a supply shock. So if you have a supply shock, especially a negative supply shock, positive supply shocks we're not too concerned with, because if positive supply shocks keep happening, that just will yield economic growth, and that's fine. However, a negative supply shock, that is going to cause the issue of stagflation. So we have increasing price level, so increasing inflation and increasing unemployment, as shown by our decreasing real GDP. If you shift aggregate demand to the right to try to counteract that, as a Keynesian would say, well, then what you're doing is you're causing more inflation. And if you try to shift aggregate demand to the left because you're trying to rein in inflation, well, then you're just causing more unemployment. So Keynesianism, when you have a negative supply shock, is really kind of at a loss here. They don't know how to fix it, because either way, you're going to make one of the problems worse. If you're trying for a lower unemployment rate, you're causing more inflation. If you're trying for less inflation, you're causing unemployment. So there's really no good solution to it, and that's where classical economists would come in and kind of laugh and say, well, this is why you just leave the economy alone, because supply will eventually shift to the right as workers accept lower nominal wages. And that is just the negative shifting demand curve to show that the increased unemployment. So when we talk about fiscal policy, and we'll go over exactly how this interacts with the graph we just saw in the next video. But when we talk about fiscal policy, this is all about taxation and government spending. So if you want to increase real GDP, you increase government spending. That's a direct effect on real GDP. Or you can decrease taxes. If you decrease taxes, that means people have more money. If people have more money, well, then they can use it to purchase stuff. So when you have more money, you choose it to spend or save. You'll spend some of it naturally, and that will affect GDP that way. Now, of course, this becomes an issue because the government gets its money through those taxes. So if the government wants to spend money, it has to take in money through taxes. So you do have to find somewhat of a balancing act so the government isn't necessarily borrowing too much. Now, government transfers can also be a part of this. Government transfers is when the government gives money to households. So if they give money to households through things like unemployment spending, or we just had the pandemic checks, that was direct money given to the households, that's a government transfer. That is something that has an effect exactly like taxes. More money goes into people's pockets. They then choose to spend or save. And then what they spend directly affects GDP and therefore aggregate demand. Some taxes will also impact investment spending. Those taxes will be explicitly talked about when you see a problem about it. It will say there are business taxes that are decreased. This should, according to the theory, increase investment spending. So that would be a sort of supply side Keynesianism, if you will. If you have expansionary fiscal policy, this is when you either increase government spending or cut taxes or increase government transfers. Expansionary fiscal policy is meant to correct for a recession. So here we have a graph of an economy in a recession. You can see that is true because we have a higher than normal level of unemployment, as evidenced by our lower than potential level real GDP. So what occurs is you increase government spending, or you cut taxes, or increase government transfers, and that shifts aggregate demand to the right, correcting that gap. If you have an inflationary gap, as you see here, as evidenced by the higher than normal level of output and therefore lower level of unemployment than the full level of unemployment. Here, in order to rein it in, you would use contractionary fiscal policy. So here you do the opposite of expansionary. You decrease government spending, or you increase taxes, or you decrease government transfers, and that will shift aggregate demand back to that long-run equilibrium. Now, of course, there are issues with fiscal policy. And a lot of those issues, other than the negative supply shock correction that's impossible, as evidenced earlier, is the issue with lags. There's a lot of different lags when you come to fiscal policy. First of all, there's the recognition lag. So here you don't even know that a recession exists, usually for a few months, because the government has to collect and analyze the data. So usually we are about 3 months into a recession before we even know we're in a recession. After we are in a recession and we've identified being in a recession, well, then we have to make a decision. The government has to develop and pass a plan. They need to pass legislation. Once again, frequently that's going to take months. And then after that, they still have to implement that plan. That takes more time to spend the money. All of this sort of builds up, and sometimes, depending on how slow the government works, it might be a year from the point of recession starts to the money starts going out the door. A full year is a long time in the economy. At that point, you might have already had the economy start self-correcting. And that is a key classical economist critique of Keynesianism right there. So this was meant to be just a broad-based introduction to these different ideas, these different types of economic policy. In the next video, we're going to go a little bit more in depth with fiscal policy and how it's implemented.